I think we can begin. Madam Prime Minister, ministers, ambassadors, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, welcome to the Riga Conference 2025. We are at the House of Sciences of the University of Latvia this year. My name is Tomass Pildegovičs. I'm here in my private capacity, but together with Latvian journalist Eva Johansone, who will be joining us very soon, we will be guiding you through the next 2.5 days of discussions, spirited debates, side events, and closed-door sessions. The theme of this year's conference is Unity, Security, and Resilience in a Fragmented World, which, in my view, sounds a bit ominous, a touch dramatic, but as Finnish President Stubb recently remarked on his visit to Riga, nostalgia is not a strategy, and clinging on to a world that no longer exists can be costly and dangerous. This conference was founded in 2006, 2 years after Latvia joined the EU and NATO, to mark the occasion of Riga hosting the NATO summit for the first time. The transformation this region has undergone since then has been remarkable. But to be honest, I'm a bit too young to really credibly reflect on that. I will leave that for the people with experience. But events are accelerating, and I think in order to focus our conversations in the coming days, I think it's useful to very briefly take stock of what concretely has transpired since last year's conference in October 2024. So first, since last year's conference, Russia has lost another 300,000 troops killed or wounded, bringing its total of casualties to over 1,117,000. On the other side of this bloody equation, this year Russia has only managed to conquer 3,800 square kilometers, so less than 1% of Ukrainian territory. Second, Russia is clearly provoking us, testing our resolve in new ways, and the number of Russian non-conventional or hybrid attacks against NATO member states has tripled in each of the past years. And as we've seen in the recent events in Estonia, Poland, Romania, Denmark, these attacks are becoming increasingly violent, increasingly reckless. Third, China has chosen to increasingly openly support Russia's war to further its own geopolitical objectives. And I could go on and on. Since last year's conference, the Assad regime has fallen in Syria. Iran's nuclear program has been set back. There is a breakthrough towards peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And of course, in the Middle East, President Trump's Gaza peace plan is gaining momentum. Unbelievably, but also this past year alone, I promise I will end soon, the EU has implemented 4 more sanctions packages against Russia, with the 19th one soon to follow. It has announced an 800 billion euro rearmament plan. So Europe is taking ownership of European security. On the NATO side, allies have historically agreed on a 5% defense spending target at the Hague summit, a figure all 3 Baltic states will reach next year already. NATO has also launched 2 new missions in this region, Baltic Sentry and Eastern Sentry. We also managed to start and end a transatlantic trade war. And last but not least, the Baltic states have completed their quest for energy independence, fully disconnected their electricity grids from Russia, and joined the EU grid. So in sum, a lot has happened, and all of these issues and their future ramifications will be at the center of debate in this year's conference. The goal, of course, being not to reminisce, but to understand how we can move forward and act from a position of strength. Finally, just a few mandatory technical notes. First, there is truly a packed program this year, so please be sure to check out all the options on the conference website and really make the most of all the opportunities. Second, please share your thoughts and insights from the conference online using the hashtag RigaConf, and use the QR code to receive a live text translation of the entire conference. This is a really unique service provided by the leading Latvian AI translation company, Tilde. So with that, I wish everyone a memorable conference. And I now give the floor to the head of the board of the Latvian Transatlantic organization, Jānis Karlsbergs. Thank you.
Thank you, Tomass. And you know, when you lose youth, you gain experience. Thank you for compliment. I'm happy to take it over. So, Your Excellency Prime Minister Evika Siliņa, Your Excellency Minister Baiba Braža, definitely I would like to say as well, Gundars, Bērziņš, thank you so much for having us here. Distinguished guests and of course, so many friends. And I was, unfortunately, we had some queuing, so many guests that we are a bit of queuing problem here. So welcome from my side to Riga conference. Last year we held it in the castle, so we were somehow digging back into the past. Today, thanks again to our very generous host, Latvian University and the Science House, we are going to look hopefully to the future. And hopefully the future will be a bit brighter. There is some kind of symbolism in it, and I think we will look into it. As a host, I have few but very important things to say. First, thank you all being such trustworthy friends of Riga conference. In fact, there are double as much as we were expecting, so registered nearly 1,200 people here. And the second important thing, I really must acknowledge all our great partners without whom this event really couldn't take place. So event as always is co-organized with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Baiba, thank you so much for your personal involvement. So that sometimes were tough, but I think we'll see how we are going. And of course, Ministry of Defense. So thank you so much. And our long-standing partners, I must read because I really don't want to miss one. Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, the European Commission, and embassies of Sweden, Canada, Germany, Spain, France, the Netherlands, Israel, Turkey, and nicely we have a new ones as well, and definitely we are looking for more for the next year as well. Heinrich Böll Stiftung, Pracnet, International Practitioners Partnership Network, Globsec, and Latvian Institute of Foreign Affairs. To our business partners, Latvian Mobile Telephone and Latvian Mobile Telephone Defense, Patria, GDLS, or General Dynamic European Land Systems, Edge Autonomy, Atlas Airspace, you can look some of exhibits as well, upstairs and in front of the doors, New 21, Miltech Association, Rail Baltica, and of course, all our multiple media partners. Your presence and trust means really a lot. Thank you so much. So, Tomass, where you started 20 years ago, and I really, as a host, I should say this as well. Summit took place here in Riga, and very first Riga conference, and I was responsible for security at that time of event as well. At that point, Baltic states had already been in 2 years, as Tomass mentioned, and there was, speaking of sense that the job is done. Finally, we are among the strongest alliance in the whole world, and European Union as well. So those were two things we joined together in parallel. The question is, in retrospective, was the job done? And my answer would be yes and no. Just to remind, agenda of those days and topics NATO summit addressed and we were addressing that time was basically about power projection, but not in power projection as we understand it today. So basically, in our first basket, when we discussed the summit agenda, were operations. We had operation in Afghanistan, we had in Iraq, we had in Kosovo. Second basket was dealing with all partnerships. And among partners, we had Ukraine and we had Russia as well. And only the third basket was speaking about defense capabilities. We call those days transformation. What really meant by transformation? Let's be honest today, looking, force reductions. And few later, there was a NATO command structure review. We lost some of our force at that time as well. But here, in Latvia, we took everything very seriously. Just an anecdotal case, when we look as well organizing summit, Riga was closed And there was, you could find on, I don't know, sure was a YouTube, but there were speed records. On the Brīvības Street, our main street, somebody did around 200 kilometers per hour. Of course, police stopped. So we took so seriously that there were 10,000 police officers and soldiers on the streets. And without kidding, at that moment, there were 3 nuclear powers, including decision makers here in Riga. And then, with our allies, we had to make all security arrangements. We had no fly zone. We were prepared for renegade situations. Only a week ago, and I know Prime Minister was coming back from Copenhagen, and there was no fly zone as well. Kind of similarities, but there is a generation in between those events. So what has changed? Defense is no longer niche only for professionals in uniform. Threats are not anymore virtual. They are real and they are here. And they affect even those who considered that Ukraine is another continent. Paralyzed airports, blackouts, arson, cyber attacks, name it. In fact, we were afraid that there is a small cyber attack on our homepage as well, but hopefully it's not so. At the moment, everything with our streaming is working. It's a new playbook for our enemies. So in Riga, 2006, NATO Secretary General of those days said, Jāp, Schefa, nothing could demonstrate more clearly how much Europe has changed for the better. And the fact that this summit is taking place here in a Latvia, a democratic Latvia, and that is free Latvia, and that's still true. That's still true. We would not be sitting here and today if there would be not NATO umbrella. And it's worth to remind, and again, to those who portray NATO as a weak, nearly dead organization. Russia loves this narrative. But is the job done? Of course, job is not done. Far from it. Ukraine is not part yet of NATO and European Union structures, but they are defending our freedoms and our world. Security and defense job will be never finished. But the next pit stop for us should be fully embracing Ukraine in NATO and European Union. And finally, despite nearly full moon, I trust that our conversations will be dynamic, controversial, but most importantly, constructive. Thank you for being here. And with this, I'm very honored to invite our Prime Minister, Evika Siliņa, to have a real speech. So, thank you.
Dear Jānis, thank you for invitation to give a speech. I hope everyone who was still standing in the line has arrived here. Dear Professor Gundars Bērziņš, dear ministers, Your Excellencies, ambassadors, dear colleagues, friends. I'm honored to be part of the opening of the Riga Conference 2025. It's really a big honor. This event remains me one of the most important annual conferences on foreign and security policy. It's a forum where we can find the solutions to our region's challenges. I would like to thank the team for organizing it and keeping the quality of discussions and participants high level. The fundamental goal of Latvia's foreign and security policy has been the same since Latvia regained independence. And the goal is that we are fully integrating ourselves in the Western world. For some of the ambassadors, it may sound strange, but for us, we know what it means, what the cost we have paid, what the price it takes. Latvian interests, values, security, and development are aligned with modern, democratic, and forward-looking part of the world. Our message is simple. Latvia stands together with its friends and allies, stronger, safer, and more united than ever. We do not face threats alone, we shape our future together. This kind of strategic clarity is grounded in 3 factors. 1, Latvia's historic experience, our geographic location, and confidence in Latvia's future. I am enormously proud of Latvians. We are fast learners and sharp thinkers. We are able to adapt and act fast. That is our advantage. As a smaller country, we can make a real difference faster. With courage, vision, and determination, we are building our future today. In 2 years since my government started to work and I took an office, Latvia has definitely become more secure, more independent, connected, resilient, more competitive, and more inclusive. This government has taken bold steps to make a difference despite so many and difficult challenges also created by Russia and its war of aggression against Ukraine. Latvia is more secure, and when I'm abroad, many my friends and my colleagues are asking me how you can make 5% of our GDP to be allocated for defense. Because yes, in 2023, Latvian defense budget was 2.23% of our GDP, but today it's 3.8, and starting from next year, it will be 5%. Is it easy? No. Latvia makes our national as well allied partners' deterrence and defense stronger, and we know why we are committed to do it. We invest in our defense capabilities in both equipment and personnel. We have made bold steps in developing a national defense industry, starting from almost nothing. Recently, we signed a memorandum of understanding with Rheinmetall, aiming to establish an ammunition production line in Latvia. We invest in security of EU and NATO, but with a special responsibility to our external border with Russia and Belarus. Because I believe Europe as a whole must take the next step. We must build stronger and more integrated industries to become more competitive and resilient in the world. Especially if we talk about the defense industries that unites our capacities and encourages innovation. Too often, our progress is slowed by fragmented markets and overlapping systems. We, those colleagues who are work within Europe, we speak a lot about fragmented markets. Because I believe we cannot afford anymore. We must act together. We have the key to financial resources, and those resources must be mobilized now. We must turn Europe's savings into Europe's security. We, the European leaders, must act as partners, as allies, and as co-creators of a European industrial strength. We are already building these bridges. We have had many discussions on the EU level about developing industries together. We must aim for a borderless European defense industry, open, collaborative, and competitive globally. I am happy to see how far we have progressed already, but more needs to be done. Faster, in close coordination with regional partners and for sure with Ukraine, which has developed crucial experience and knowledge. Part of it is to develop drone and anti-drone capabilities to increase security of our airspace. That is my top priority as the Prime Minister of Latvia, that our people are safe. Because living next to Russia and Belarus, safety, deterrence, defense cannot be on politicians' agenda. We must have this on our agenda because those are our everyday questions. And people are safe because the governments are ensuring actual results, and our people have hope for a better future. I can say Latvia is more independent. In February this year, Latvian energy sector disconnected from BREL, Russian and Belarusian electricity grid. Instead, we fully joined the electricity grid of continental Europe. Even before that, we stopped buying Russian gas, and now 75% of our LNG imports come from the US partners. Could we be thinking like 3-5 years ago it is possible to be done in such a short time? No. But can we do it? Yes, if we have a politician's will. Energy prices are steady with a tendency to decline. Our goal remains to produce more electricity and to become a net exporter of energy. Latvia is more connected right now because we continue to develop Latvian transport sector connectivity with other parts of Europe. And just recently, the German aviation giant Lufthansa invested in our Air Baltic. And despite some challenges of governance and funding, as well as regional cooperation, Rail Baltica, which is a railway project, is as well on a track. It's a large and complicated project, but it's very important for our military mobility. And I can say that Latvia is now more resilient. Latvians always has been strong and capable of surviving and even thrilling through difficult times. Today, Latvian society is more aware of different kinds of threats, including hybrid ones. We, as a society, know the tactics of our enemies, and we want to be, and we are prepared. At the same time, we are constantly improving. We are strengthening our cyber and informational space. We continue building this whole society approach to our security, linking all stakeholders and different phases of crisis management. We have seen how resilience of democratic systems has been constantly tested. We know it by our experience. Because as well, most recently, we all experienced the parliamentary elections in Moldova. Despite enormous pressure, Moldova successfully held transparent and credible elections. We as well shared our knowledge and expertise in preparatory process of those elections. Now, Moldova has the experience to share with us. Latvia is more competitive. In the last 2 years, my government has focused on strengthening our economy and making it easier to grow and to invest. Now, Latvian banks give more loans to both companies and individuals. Our real estate market is developing faster, with Riga overtaking Tallinn in development and purchases of new homes. And we have a second most competitive tax system, and we continue to reduce bureaucracy both nationally and on EU level. Because our goal is to create an economy that supports innovation, industry, and strategic investment, especially in high-tech and defense sectors. This is how we position Latvia and Europe for the next decade as leaders in technology and defense industry. Why defense? Because, as you remember, we live in persistent threat which is coming from Belarus and Russia. It's just our everyday calendar. That's on our schedule, that's on our tables. But we learn from that experience, and we are able to share that experience. We already have so much to be proud of. Latvia is a digital country. More than 90% of public services are available online. We can start a company completely online without even leaving your office in Germany or in Switzerland or even in US. We have established a National Center for Artificial Intelligence, and we see AI as a crucial part of Europe's future as well. To conclude, Latvia and Europe must look forward to a future where security, innovation, and collaboration define our continent. We must act boldly as politicians. Sometimes those decisions which are not made today can be a big consequence in the nearest future. Therefore, I am a loud voice in Europe's committees and meetings, protecting my society's rights, Europeans' rights, against threats from Russia and hybrid threats. Because I believe today we are not just fighting for our physical security, but we are fighting for values of democracy. And democracy is not something which is just here. We need to fight for it, because there is no better option for us as to live in a democratic society. So Latvia stands confident and forward-looking. We will continue to support Ukraine with allocation of 0.25% of our GDP. The Latvian voice and the European voice must be louder, smarter, and more credible than ever before. We must use it to build a safer, stronger, and more united Europe with Ukraine and Moldova as a part of it. And I wish you all good discussions, change contacts, and I believe in stronger Latvia, in stronger society, and in stronger democratic society in the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Madam Prime Minister, for your words of wisdom, for your opening speech. I would now like to give the floor for one final opening speech to the man who has very generously led us into his home, so to say, the Rector of the University of Latvia, Professor Gundars Bērziņš. Thank you.
Excellencies, Prime Minister, distinguished ministers, honored guests, and welcome to University of Latvia. Welcome to Riga, where October usually brings frost, but not today, but also some of the year's finest and clearest thinking time. We are grateful for you to choose spending these days with us at University of Latvia in the House of Science, built for exactly these kind of hard conversations. This is a 20th Riga conference, 20 years of essential transatlantic dialogue, and never has a dialogue been more urgent and more complex in the same time as today. Over the next 3 days, you will address questions that define Europe's future. Can we sustain Ukraine, not just military, but also as a functioning state? Where do we find resources for reconstruction, and should they come from frozen Russian assets? How do we accelerate defense production when procurement procedures are in a line for years, but threats come in months' time? Can democracies compete technologically when authoritarian powers move without democratic constraints. You bring remarkable experience to those discussions. Defense ministers, EU commissioners, central bank governors, and NATO military leadership, intelligence professionals, and civil society defenders. The insight developed here will inform policy across Europe and Atlantic. These aren't academic questions. There are operational realities you face daily. Just last month, our researchers presented findings at Helsinki Security Forum, opened by President Stubb of Finland. The study examined crisis preparedness across 7 cities: Helsinki, Riga, Tallinn, Vilnius, Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich. The findings were sobering. Only a small percentage of urban residents can remain self-sufficient for even 72 hours during infrastructure disruptions. That means that puts huge strain on government's ability to function in these conditions. Everything you'll discuss here today and tomorrow and day after tomorrow, mobility, military mobility, crisis resilience, social cohesion, depends on this information and ability to function as a strong government in any situation. We have chosen to hold this conference in Riga, the city that has survived empires, occupation, and attempts of erasure. We don't speak about security threats as theoretical abstract. The undersea cables you'll discuss run through our waters. The disinformation campaigns you'll analyze target our citizens. The question of whether democracies can deter aggression, that's not a theoretical question for us. The lived experience shapes our research and teachings, and what we can offer as your host, the understanding that comes from being at frontier, an urgency that comes from knowing what a failure costs. This house of science was built for difficult conversations grounded in evidence and data. Over the next 3 days, I hope you'll challenge assumptions, demand specifics, and leave with actionable insights. Welcome to Riga, welcome to University of Latvia, welcome to this essential work you do and all of you do. And thank you very much for being here.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is now the time for the first plenary session of the conference. The quota of speeches has been fulfilled. The first panel will be titled, What Next on the Road to Peace Through Strength? Of course, with no indications that Russia's ready to stop its aggression or even meaningfully revise its war aims. What are the next steps to pressure Russia towards peace? What vectors of pressure, military, economic, technological, will be the most effective? And I hand over the floor to the moderator of the panel, U.S. national editor and columnist at FT, Edward Luce, to introduce the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here. I think I'll just get the speakers on the stage. Minister Brazé, Ambassador Whitaker, Admiral, how are you? Lovely to see you. Admiral Bauer, Jack Watling, Ambassador, how are you?
I'm well, how are you?
We have a hybrid microphone situation here.
Good to see you. Good to be there.
I don't think any of them need any introduction, but I'll give you a brief one before I set the table, as it were. To my immediate right, Latvian Foreign Minister Baiba Brazē, a well-known figure to all of you, needs no introduction. To her left, Ambassador Matt Whitaker, the US Ambassador to NATO. Again, no introduction necessary. Admiral Bob Bauer to his left, formerly chair of the Military Commission of NATO, just retired recently. And to the Admiral's left, Jack Watling of the Royal United Services Institute. And expert in all things war and Ukraine. So that's the panel. It's a very important topic. What next on the road to peace through strength? I think, it's a good question, but it's more of an aspiration than a description of what's happening. So I'm going to use my journalistic prerogative to just rephrase to what I think we all want to talk about, which is what is Russia up to and what can we do to stop it? That's basically the theme of this panel. And just to sort of recap where we are, we've heard a little bit of this, but clearly there is a lateralization of Putin's war on Ukraine going on. We've seen, of course, the closure of Munich airport recently. We've seen the breaching of Estonian airspace, drones in Poland, drones in Romania, Denmark, Germany. We've seen a lot of hybrid warfare, more than normal. And we've seen discussion even this morning in my own paper of NATO weighing up whether to shoot down Russian MiGs, whether this will now be an escalated posture in response to future incursions. So an extremely volatile and dynamic situation that we're going to be looking at. And of course, at the same time, Ukraine extending its range, striking Russian oil refineries more than 1,000 kilometers away, up to a third of Russian capacity at any one moment being taken offline. A pretty extraordinary Ukrainian sort of improvisation going on here, which is hitting Putin's bottom line. And then finally, the great sort of, perhaps the greatest imponderable across the Atlantic is whether President Trump has finally sort of got religion on Ukraine. We have seen moments where we thought that, and then that hasn't been the case. And it is sort of, I think, more than 5 months now since President Trump said to Putin, ceasefire within 2 weeks or else. And we've yet to see what that all else is. So this is a very, very important imponderable as well, all of which I think we're going to get into. I am strongly biased against opening statements, but I appreciate that the two senior government people on this panel, Foreign Minister Braze and Ambassador Whitaker, have slightly different needs to the two non-government people on the panel. So they will make opening statements. I will sort of prompt you with a question. Let me start with you, Minister Braze. You've recently participated in the NATO summit in The Hague. You've promised 5%, well, 3.5% to be precise, on defense. You're getting there, as the Prime Minister just outlined, and other Baltics and Poland, but most of Europe is nowhere close. How soon, if ever, is Europe going to seriously operationalize as a coordinated military force, as opposed to having lots of little armies that duplicate each other? When can we expect, how quickly can we expect speed and scale of what was pledged in The Hague?
I think the answer is pretty straightforward. 10 years ago in Wales, we had a declaration on 2% in 10 years for defense spending. And we also had the Wales Declaration itself, which was more than 13,000 words. In The Hague, we had the decision to spend 5% of GDP on defense, and the declaration, which was barely 400 words. Mm-hmm. So what I mean is, it's not about words, it's about action. So that's what we are doing, and that plan is pretty straightforward also for the others. By 29, there is a review, and then another 5 years, and it should be 5% on defense spending. And again, when you look at what type of capabilities we need, we are all interdependent. And as Sekur, the Supreme Allied Commander, points out, he doesn't really care how you take a tank out by javelin or by armed drones or anything else. But those capabilities need to be there. because the planning that NATO has done is against the Russian capabilities of 21. So for a while we are okay, but Rob can tell more about it. He was the one actually planning all that. But clearly for the national understanding is we all have concrete capability targets that we need to reach. And then within NATO's framework, there is a planning and evaluation process. So the planners and evaluators come back to you, where you are, what you need to achieve. And then we test it on the ground. And that's how the big exercises, that's how the multinational deployments in our country and other countries take place. It's exercising, it's testing, it's being ready, but you need capabilities for that. It's not for the payment of pensions, those 5% or 1.5% for the resilience. So this is, I think, where all of us sort of understood that what we all decided needs to be implemented, and that feeling of the threat to European security is real. But again, NATO is bigger than just Europe.
I mean, from Putin's point of view, though, having a joint action review in 2029, that doesn't sound too scary. I mean, how quickly will potential gaps, if the US does draw down in Europe to some degree, and I'm about to ask Ambassador Whitaker that as well, but how quickly can these gaps be filled? How much urgency do you feel that your colleagues have? I mean, you're sitting here, on the edge, bordering Russia. You obviously don't need a kick up the backside.
We are all on edge.
You're all on edge, but there are parts of NATO that do not have the same feeling.
That I can't say. You have to be more precise. From what I know, we have our Turkish friends here. They are also on the front line. It's a different front line, but it's a front line. And they very clearly are investing in defense, and they've been doing that before the Hague decisions. Obviously, it's not an easy process. As the Prime Minister said, we are cutting budget. We are cutting foreign ministry's budget. We are cutting, very realistic payments to people to certain other branches. Plus, there is more borrowing for defense capabilities. Because there are needs. Mm-hmm. But it will return to the economy. Economy is also changing. The technologies, the dual technologies, the production, it is a different mindset, but it's also a different type of economy that is being created through that. So it's not like it's lost as a water and sand. And in the same time, yes, there are different capability targets for different countries. Those further, away from Russia have different ones. But it doesn't mean that they don't have to invest. They have to invest. And Luxembourg has said they will invest. So that's why there is a review process, because actually you need an understanding who is doing what. Because at the end, yes, those are national armies, but we are all in it together in terms of NATO. So, and that's why I compared the Wales Declaration versus the Hague Declaration and the realism of those decisions.
I'm in favour of brevity. Less is more in terms of your Wales-Hague contrast. Ambassador, that's really the same question to you. And you were in The Hague, of course, as well for this summit. It is a pretty dramatic pledge on paper, but as by far the largest and the sort of the pillar of the central pillar of NATO, what is the American perspective on whether Europe can finally put not just its money where its mouth is, but operationalize that money in a really meaningful way that would be noticed in Moscow quite soon?
Well, great question. It's good to be with you, and thanks for moderating this. It's good to be with my good friend, the minister. It's good to be with the admiral, the doctor. I feel under-credentialed to sit on this panel. So we got a lawyer and a journalist. This is kind of a start of a joke, I guess. And I do have some remarks here, and I want to cover some of these important points because this discussion is crucial. It's one of the main reasons I'm traveling so much, getting around the alliance even during a government shutdown, because right now we're in year one of the Hague Defense Commitment, and it's going to be crucial that it is every year operationalized, and that the growth and the accountability which we built in to this process and the capability targets, which are different from the Wales pledge, is brought to life. And it can't be. I just want to state the obvious. It can't be divorced from the war in Ukraine. I think if you talk about Europe's credibility and commitment to continental conventional security, it's directly related to Europe's commitment to what's happening right now on the ground in Ukraine. And so, that's the first test, really. If you talk about sort of how much Europe is leaning in, willing to take this over from the United States and share the burden, equalize the burden, and strengthen the alliance, you can point to the support for Ukraine as almost a direct proxy for that, I would say. A couple other things that that I want to mention is I think in all of this conversation about Europe stepping up, Europe spending money, Europe increasing their real war fighting, whether that's lethality, whether that is brigades, whether that is tanks, artillery, sort of real war fighting capabilities that contribute to our collective defense. I think we also have to acknowledge, and I don't want to dismiss, 5% is defense and defense related. And you're right to say it's 3.5% on NATO capability targets. But the 1.5% is at least as important, if not more important, as we see every single day here in Latvia and across really the European continent together with the United States. Border security, relevant. It's being, migration is being weaponized by our adversaries. So that is clearly a national security issue. Infrastructure, cybersecurity, there's just so many things that we all need to invest in that we're seeing the results of if we don't invest, what could be our future. And I think I always refer to my friends here in Latvia as a model ally, and there's a reason. It's because they're doing everything that they should be doing for their individual defense, and according to the Washington Treaty, therefore that investment in their individual defense is what makes the collective defense strong and lethal, and really make sure that NATO is relevant, for decades to come. The Hague was mentioned. I think that was a massive win for the alliance. I think it did demonstrate at least a political commitment. But every single country and every single budget has to demonstrate that each individual ally is serious. One of the things we had. I gave out some gifts as all of our European allies came back from many of them. Take some time off in the summer. It's not a tradition we have in the United States, but anyway, I gave them all an American football helmet, a mini-sized American football helmet. And one of the things that I did is I put a NATO flag on it, I put a U.S. flag, and I put their country's flag on it. But then I also put gold stars, 1 star for each % of GDP they're spending on defense. And I have a lot more gold stars to hand out as we see the increase. And I'll be glad to have those ceremonies, in my office, is to give out those gold stars, because it is an important reminder of where some of these countries are at and where they need to get. And so, I think that was important. But we're expecting, and the United States is expecting, that all these countries take this pledge very seriously and do invest year over year. United States obviously is at about 3.5%, depending on how you count the one-time money that made last year's defense budget. Since we're in a new fiscal year, about $1 trillion. And so when people sometimes suggest that the United States isn't exactly at sort of what we're requiring from our allies, I say, well, you can meet us at $1 trillion then. Either way, we need everybody to spend a lot more money. And then, finally, I want to point and highlight one other thing. This morning, the foreign minister and I were able to go to Edge Autonomy here in Riga, which is a manufacturer that makes drones. They're American owned, but they have the facility here, and have Latvian employees, and innovation, and making sure that as we defend every single inch of the alliance and keep our 1 billion citizens that live in NATO territory safe, that we are innovating and that we're not having to. I'm a state school grad, so I don't have the credentials, nor do I have the education of many of those here. But nonetheless, we have to find more efficient ways to defend ourselves. We cannot spend $1 or $2 million on a missile to take out a $400 drone. That's, and so we're going to have to continue to innovate. And that's another area where I think, as a model ally, my friends here in Latvia, and the reason I'm back here for the second time, so it's the only country I've come back and visited twice in my first 6 months in office. Yeah, I'm going to come back every 90 days, we've agreed, just to check in and see what's going on. But the innovation and the technology and the ability to then test it within the NATO territories. I mean, there's just some really exciting things going on, whether it's the exercise grounds that are being developed here, or whether it is the eastern line of defense, whether it's our enhanced vigilance activities. This is when NATO's working. It is doing these types of things. And so you talk about sort of the message for Vladimir Putin. The message is that, not only are we preparing, but we are going to be so strong that strength is going to ensure the peace, because nobody is going to want to challenge NATO, because we're politically aligned, we're friends, and the alliance has invested in the necessary capabilities to be credible and real deterrents.
Thanks.
That's only half my prepared remarks, but
You did well. You did well. You've both done very well. Thank you for shrinking your prepared remarks. So I'm hoping for an unprepared answer here. And just two quite brief follow-ups. One is, you mentioned Ukraine is where the rubber really hits the road in terms of this 5% target. And talking of Ukraine, there is now discussion in Washington, or more than discussion, of Donald Trump approving the sale of Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine, 1,500-mile or so ranges. Pretty, at least on a symbolic level, a pretty dramatic potential signal that Trump really is changing, really has got religion on Ukraine. Is this going to happen?
I'm not going to front run any announcements from the White House. I've learned long ago.
We need to see it on the battlefield.
That the last thing to do is to suggest that President Trump doesn't have the absolute authority to announce that at an appropriate time what his decision is. What I would tell you is that obviously having a bigger payload further down range is certainly something that could change Putin's calculation, but so is more interdiction of the shadow fleet. So likewise, the entire prioritized Ukraine requirements list packages that are now moving at pace, I think, is another demonstration of the resolve of NATO and our allies and the United States of America, because this is not only air defense to protect the Ukrainians, but it is also very significant weapons that can be used on the battlefield by the Ukrainians as well. So I think that there are a lot of things that we are doing now that we were not doing when I got here in April that are going to continue to increase the pressure on Vladimir Putin to show up and negotiate peace in Ukraine, because that's really ultimately what President Trump wants. I mean, we now have news are reporting that we have an agreement on Gaza. That's a huge victory. That, again, depending on how you're counting, and I know you're a skeptical journalist, so I'll suggest that's the 7th or maybe the 8th peace deal that President Trump has helped with, brokered, or otherwise arranged.
This includes the one between Cambodia and Armenia.
Yes. Yes, and
cheap joke. I apologize.
That's a very cheap joke, but you never know. No, but in all seriousness, I mean, I think there's, if you think about the Gaza war, that certainly is a dispute that has been decades in the making, and the Ukraine war again, depending on how you look at it, could be centuries in the making. From why Vladimir Putin decided the time was in 2022 to ultimately invade, even though after he had already taken Crimea, I grant it, and sort of no reason. We all know the facts. We don't have to get into sort of exactly what happened. But my point is that some of these settlements are going to take a little bit of work, and we always expect sort of an instantaneous, like Donald Trump makes a phone call and we have a deal, and sometimes that is what happens. But in this case, obviously Vladimir Putin is deciding to be recalcitrant, and we're going to have to continue to increase the pressure, and that's what is happening right now, and we still have many more cards to play, as President Trump has said.
So the other follow-up I'll reserve till later, because I want to get to Admiral Bauer. Admiral, you've got a reputation for being a blunt speaker. You're a military man, and you're Dutch, so I guess that's kind of over-determined. But your best assessment of this lateralization that we've been seeing by Putin in the last few weeks, is this a sign of confidence or a sign of desperation? Is it because he fears that these increasingly effective Ukrainian restrictions on the oil export, the money machine that's fueling his war, are becoming more effective? Or is it because he sees Europe and the West in general as weak and worth probing? Or is it both? What's your best assessment of what's in Putin's mind right now?
I think in a way is good news what he's doing, because it shows that our support to Ukraine is effective. If it wouldn't have been, he wouldn't have done this. And so in many ways, this is a sign of desperation. And for many sad reasons for him and good reasons for Ukraine, this is about the Ukrainians being more effective to hit him at home in his logistics, in his military capacity to fight the war and continue to fight the war. We are approaching the point where a 3-day war will be longer than the First World War. And that's not too far away. So as long as the Russians fight, the Ukrainians have to fight. That's the simple truth. I mean, if the Russians stop the war today, pack their gear and go home, the war is over. If the Ukrainians stop the war today, they've lost their country. So there is no equal footing for the two. So if Vladimir Putin is doing this, he is in a way desperate. I'm absolutely convinced. And what he's doing actually, and this is not the first time he is testing us with hybrid actions. The summer of 2024 was also a busy summer where we saw even assassination attempts on the CEO of Rheinmetall. We saw arson, we saw the packages on the DHL flights, we saw cyber attacks, we saw drones as well. So this is not the first time per se. We've seen fighter aircraft approaching our airspace and infringing our airspace. So in itself, it's not new. So that's something we also have to remind. Secondly, I think it is extremely important the way we have responded, because you cannot necessarily prevent someone to fly into your airspace or sail into your sea. That's not possible to prevent that at all. So the most important thing is that you have to show that you actually see them and that you then respond. And that's actually what happened. And not just Poland, but NATO. In Poland, it was an Italian AWACS, it was German Patriot, it was Dutch F-35s, and of course the Polish fighter aircraft. So this was a combined response. You don't necessarily have to shoot down everything. I keep reminding people as well. It's a decision by the government. It's not a necessity per se, because we have to be careful not to overreact. I mean, an infringement in your airspace is not good, but it doesn't mean it's the start of a war. So the fact that we have responded, I mean, the Italian F-35s guided these two fighter aircraft out of Estonia after having visual contact. Mm-hmm. And so the Russians are not stupid. And the Russians are not there to start a war with us. I'm absolutely convinced. They are out there to make, to basically try to start a debate in our nations to say, why should we give all these weapons to Ukraine when the threat here goes up. And then they point, and everybody points at the
That
drones.
would imply that he's trying to raise the cost of spending at home in order to divert it from Ukraine.
Yes. So, but we shouldn't be diverted by this, because first and foremost, this is not the start of a war. This is a tactics to change our minds, or the minds of the people in our nations, because of fear. We shouldn't be fearful. We shouldn't. We have responded. We have responded in the right way, together, in unity, with strength. And it doesn't mean with strength killing everything. So the fact that the drones were not shot down in Denmark had other reasons. It's a decision by the government, nobody else's. So I think we should rest assured that the alliance as a whole, the individual nations' armed forces are responding to this. Now, the one thing we have to become better at is shooting this down, if we want to, with cheaper weapons. And that is an industrial problem. And to the point of Ambassador Whittaker, that I think by now, the money issue, it's not solved per se, but the decisions have been taken and the nations have to do what they have promised, all of the nations. But money is less and less of a problem. There's a lot of chiefs of defense with fat wallets, and then they come into the shop and then there's empty shelves. So the industrial production capacity issue is something which we haven't solved yet, and we are 3.5 years into the war. And if we don't solve that, and by God, we are the richest part of the world. We have everything to do this. We have the money, we have the creativity, we have the minds of all the people, we have the hands and the people. So why are we not solving this? Why? Because it is still not seen as a crisis. When COVID hit us, from the king or the president to the people that pick up the garbage, everybody could get COVID. And therefore we saw this as a national crisis. And then we started to act. And public money and private money together made it possible to come up with a vaccine in 8 months' time. We can solve these problems easily. I'm really convinced of this. But we have to focus.
Yeah, I think that's a very timely and clear message, and I'm going to sort of pass it on to Jack. In terms of the capacity, the industrial capacity, and the politics of getting to common industrial capacity, we're seeing France and Germany yet again falling out over the joint strike fighter thing. That was announced by Macron and Merkel years ago, 8 years ago, I think. They're now sort of falling out again. They're supposed to be fixing it. But if this were urgent, surely the leaders would be overriding. And then, of course, we have many parallels to that example. Another recent one is Ursula von der Leyen suggesting Europe build a drone wall. Now, maybe that's a Maginot line in the air, and that's just sort of the wrong image to use. And I think she was corrected by some people to that effect. But it suggests that what the Admiral's just been saying, that there isn't a sense of urgency amongst the European publics. Therefore, that political transmission mechanism to governments isn't yet strong enough to get the kind of urgent spending we need. And then, secondly, Putin sees the 6th French prime minister in 21 months. He sees Nigel Farage leading the polls in Britain. He sees populists and NATO skeptics on the rise in most of Europe in some form or another. Isn't there strong grounds to be skeptical that, in fact, what was pledged in The Hague is still worth it only on paper only? And it's my job to play devil's advocate. I'm just... sorry.
Can I just insert one fact?
Yeah.
I just looked at my notes. Within the last year, we have added 10% of real money to the spending.
Okay.
Across European allies. Only across European allies.
That's a fair correction.
Which is 43 billion euros.
Yep.
So that's in real money that has been allocated for defense spending.
Fair point. Jack?
I think the thing we have to recognize is that not all solutions are quick to implement, and you can't immediately translate cash into capability. The reality is in Europe, we have a very, very strong scientific base. We can design and build exquisite weapons that completely overmatch Russian capability in most areas. There are a couple of areas where the Russians have a particular advantage. But over the last 30 years, we have stripped out the second and in particular the third tiers of our supply chains to the point where if you go to our manufacturers and say, I want to double, triple production, here's the cash, I actually have the cash, they don't have any raw materials to draw upon. Those raw material extraction routes are very constrained. If we were to desperately manufacture drones, right, and line the eastern flank with UAVs, it would be great, but you would be buying all of the batteries and the motors from China. And looking at the US's defense planning assumptions, that would not be wise, right, as a basis for our security. We can build ammunition filling plants all we like, but if we haven't secured the supply of cotton and nitrocellulose and nitric acid so that we can actually make the explosives and the propellants, then all you're going to do is drive up the price of shells. You're not actually going to increase output. I'll give you another interesting one. You know, aerospace is an area where we have a huge advantage, right, over the Russians. But the European aerospace industry, and actually the US aerospace industry, still relies on Russia primarily as the source of refined titanium, which is incidentally why the manufacturers of most of Russia's missile fuselages and core components in a lot of their weapon systems are unsanctioned. Okay? Now, the Ukrainians might cause problems for both Russia and us by sanctioning them in more tangible ways in the near future. But the reality is that you can't just build titanium refining capacity overnight. Yeah? And so if we want to get after these problems, the thing to watch in a lot of cases is how much of that 1.5% is being put into the backbone of industrial resilience so that we can show the Russians that we can't just wipe the floor with them on day one if they pick a fight with us, because we do overmatch them, but that we can keep that capability going. And so the real tragedy, I think, is that we didn't make those decisions in 2022, because none of the math has changed, right? We knew what needed to be done in 2022. Money got poured into stabilizing energy prices and other crises. We drew heavily from stockpiles rather than investing upstream in the supply chain. And so now we're in this situation where there is finally political agreement that there is a need, but there is a lag in our ability to translate that political clarity into tangible output. And the more we can do to narrow that gap, the better.
Okay, we're going to return to this and develop this, but I just want to ask you, Minister, this debate about having a stronger, a more robust latitude for European air defences in terms of the next MiG incursions. And you mentioned Turkey. Turkey did actually shoot down a Russian plane a few years ago without any massive retaliation. Are you part of this debate? In which side are you on it, and where is it going to end up? Are we going to get stronger? Are we going to get stronger permissions for European air defence personnel?
So we had that discussion with the new Secretary, General Grinkiewicz, who was here actually also 2 times already. And
twice for everybody. This is my first time here, by the way.
I hope you get to see something. The procedures are pretty straightforward. So I think for a politician, the best answer I have heard is President Trump stop again. He was quoted here is, no, we don't shoot them down. We first identify, we evaluate, and then we decide what to do with it. And that depends on what is actually happening.
So
that is something that the Turkish allies did quite a number of times with those Russian planes that were violating again and again. Then they notified them that their processes and procedures have changed. And then they did what they did. And the Russians were not surprised.
Ongoing, huh?
and there was no war.
was a war ongoing with
And
Syria.
the Russians were not surprised because they knew Turks had changed the procedures. Okay, so and it's very clear, I think, for politicians not to get involved in this military sort of reality, because we have to rely on the military advice. Yes, we give political guidance, how we evaluate together with our intel people. You know, there is a joint threat assessment, there is evaluation on the ground on a daily basis, what is happening, this and that. But at the end, for politicians, it's important to give political guidance, but rely on military advice. Do we need to step up? Do we need to change those procedures? Because again, as Rob said, it's you don't want to do something just by accident, right? So that is, I think, the most important thing.
I mean, some politicians, I confess I admit he is a more plain-speaking one, but Radek Sikorski has said publicly that this permission should be there.
I think what Radek said was to his Russian counterparts, if you continue to infringe upon NATO airspace, do not be surprised if you are shot down, i.e. indicating that the decision could be made, but he didn't say any aircraft that enters our airspace will be shot down.
I appreciate the distinction, but I think what was heard was what was heard. Let's get to the.
But it's important because deterrence actually is about not telling exactly what you're going to do.
Of course, which is peace through strength. I understand that concept. Ambassador, the elephant in the room here is whether President Trump...
I don't weigh that much.
And no, you don't. You look very svelte.
I think it's bullying.
Svelte to me.
No,
Yeah, I think it's bullying.
it's the chair. It's a small chair.
You are evading the question, but it's still coming. The big, so far unexplored topic is whether President Trump really has, following Alaska, following Putin's habit, this pattern of escalating every time Trump calls for a ceasefire, which seems to be to deliberately, rub his nose in it. And it seems like Trump might have reached a process of exhaustion with this dialectic, and that we might finally be at the point where he sees this war from Ukraine's perspective for what seems to be like the first time, and that he's also clearly impressed by Ukraine's ability to take out Russian oil refineries. What's your best description of where your president's mind is right now?
Yeah, this is always dangerous again, and so
Sorry,
I'm gonna answer it from my perspective as the U.S. ambassador to NATO. I cannot, this is when I was Attorney General in the last Trump administration. I'd often, a tweet would come out because it's back in the Twitter days, and I was then asked to interpret it, and I quickly learned that the answer is that the tweet speaks for itself. President Trump communicates a lot, and all you have to do is read what he's saying, because he doesn't have he has strategies certainly in his own mind that he's following through, but like where you are on sort of his plan to execute his strategy is kind of what he's telling you, and there's no sort of, he doesn't hide the ball when he's communicating, let's say. So that being said, is I think where we're at right now is you're seeing it. I mean, he's talking about providing Tomahawk missiles to the Ukrainians. He's talking about additional sanctions. He's also talking about real leverage, which is European allies to stop buying Russian oil. And we've had there's been a great transition away from European Russian electricity, Russian gas, Russian oil. But there's a few allies that are still, because of legacy pipelines mostly, buying Russian oil and gas, and we're working with each and every one of those to help them transition as quickly as possible, because that's the right thing to do. And again, it makes, not only does the United States have a lot to sell, especially in the LNG markets, but it also, I think, it creates sort of the way an alliance should work. The way NATO should work should be not only do we fight together, but we trade together, and we're friends and allies. And that's the culture that I'm trying to bring with my interactions as well at NATO. So President Trump is certainly sees with his own eyes what's happening in the war in Ukraine. I think his recent optimism that Ukraine quite possibly could take back territory. I mean, I think that does signal something. We're just going to have to all wait and see where that gets us. But ultimately, he just wants the killing to end. I mean, I see the same numbers that he sees, and he is, comments about how 7,000 Russian soldiers every single week. I mean, it's just, you can't, we couldn't even fit 7,000 people in this room, if we were all, touching each other. I mean, that's how, it's just such a massive casualty rate every single week, that, he feels for just the human tragedy that's happening on the battlefield in Ukraine. And obviously through our Prioritize Ukraine Requirements list and so many other programs that we're making available, I think he is, helping Ukraine defend itself. Ukraine is fighting bravely, and we're just going to have to see if this combination in the ever increasing pressure that the United States, together with our allies, that's the most important thing, that we all put the pressure on Vladimir Putin to get him to end the war.
Okay, I want to sort of stay on this theme for a moment, but let me just check the time. I don't know who's it. Oh yeah, who's in charge here? Because we started.
They will tell us.
I'm in charge.
We started a few. Okay, and
I paid for this microphone.
We started a few
Just
minutes
let's
late.
keep
right?
talking because they will get us off the stage when necessary.
Okay, so I'm assuming I'm telling whoever's in charge that we're finishing at 3:30, not 3:20, because we started 10, 15 minutes late. But Admiral, the same question to you. It is a deep concern across this continent and in the United States that the center may not hold, that Trump could change his mind, and that therefore the contingency planning that Europeans ought to be, that America's NATO partners ought to be undertaking, should be even greater than what we've been discussing. Is that fair?
I think there's this sort of idea sometimes in Europe that the Americans let us down or are letting us down. I think it's the other way around. We have let the United States down for decades because they had to take the brunt of the work. And the point has come where the American people say, and it's not a Republican, President Trump, MAGA issue, it is across the political spectrum, that the American people are sick and tired of Europeans and Canadians that do not take responsibility for their security. So that's one. So this will not go away. And therefore, we need to do more. And actually, the good news about The Hague is not just the 3.5% and the 5%. It is actually that we have agreed, the nations have agreed, that what was like this, the United States contribution to NATO and Europe and Canada, is going to be like this, as it should be for many, many decades already. So what will happen is that European nations, if they invest in the right things as agreed with NATO, because there is a very practical shopping list per nation, what the nations are going to buy, should buy. Now the money is there, the industrial capacity issue we talked about, so if all that comes together, they should buy these capabilities. And if Europe and Canada do that, then actually Europe and Canada get capabilities that now only the US has. And if that happens, then Europe and Canada become more capable to do things either in Europe or in their own nation or wherever. There's never going to be a European army. I get this question every day. There's never going to be a NATO army. There's nations that have armed forces. And they either give them to UN, to EU, or to NATO, or keep them for themselves. That's the reality. So if that happens, then Europe becomes more capable. Then the US, as they have to, refocus and reprioritize part of their armed forces to wherever place they want to reprioritize it to, most likely in the Indo-Pacific. Then we can look after Europe. And that doesn't mean the US is not with us anymore. US is not leaving NATO. US is not leaving us alone if there's less forces in Europe, that's something else. But the US is still part of NATO and is still part of this promise that they will come to the rescue if we have an Article 5 situation. So I'm not concerned about that at all. And the United States is more than President Trump. That's also something we shouldn't forget. There's a Congress which is very much in favor of NATO and of everything that is connected to that. So I take President Trump very seriously because actually everything he promised his voters he has done in the past. So we shouldn't think he's kidding. You can disagree with what he says, but actually he's doing what he promised. So we should take him very seriously. And the way he then communicates is something sometimes maybe confusing, or it's not always clear exactly where it eventually will lead to. But as President Zelensky said, President Trump is now supporting Ukraine in a just way, because I think in the end it is absolutely clear for the whole world, except for Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, and some other nations, that Russia started this war, this unjust war, and they never should win this war, and actually they should lose it.
Okay, so I'm just warning the audience that I'm going to give you about 20, 25 minutes of questions, and assuming we'll ending at 3:30, that means I'll go to you quite soon. Jack, one way the Europeans can rapidly put their money where their mouth is this $200 billion of Russian frozen central bank reserves, and where that plan is being developed. It sounds devilishly clever, ways around Belgium's objections and the Euroclear stuff. But $200 billion is real money. Ukraine says it needs about 100 billion a year or euros. Do you think this is going to happen? And if it does it buy some of the things? Does it fill some of these empty shelves all on its own, just by the pure financial scale?
I mean, finance is not my area of expertise, right? I'm a military analyst. So I'm just going to reflect what people I've spoken to have pointed out, which is that the Russians do have a desire, and you saw Lavrov talking about a new world order. What he is referring to is something that the Russians also discuss internally quite extensively, and it is an attempt to fracture the international community, where there is a Russian dominant pillar that has significant control over natural resources and supply chains, and therefore leverage over other countries. And they talk about de-dollarization and the breaking of the international financial structure as a critical target, right? This is why they talk about a BRICS currency and all this stuff. Now, if we want to accelerate the fracturing of the international financial system, going and setting a precedent where if you have a disagreement with another country, you just seize outright the assets that are in your country, it may well be one way to do it, right? And it would be interesting to see how many countries that have claims against members of NATO for historic disputes, whether it be territorial, whether it be over slavery and issues like that, decide that actually our sovereign assets around the world are also just seizable, right? And so I don't think that we will go down that route, because I think it opens a Pandora's box in the eyes of a lot of officials. It's very attractive, but the reality is, I think we have the money. I don't think that's the real issue. As I said before, I think it's our capacity to translate money into the equipment the Ukrainians need.
So my understanding of why this is such an ingenious method is precisely that it isn't seizing the money, it's borrowing against it.
Right, which is a different
against
thing
future reparations. It's like securitizing future revenue streams.
But this is why
so legally that is allegedly satisfying the Belgians. But I'll ask Minister Braze about this, because I know you're involved in these discussions. This is a really, really important signal of whether Europe's serious.
Absolutely. And again, there are certain situations when those discussions are best conducted in private and not screaming loudly in public, and to find that solution. But quite clearly, everybody has a consensus in Europe that that money is not going back to Russia. whatever we call it, it has to be used for Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction. So that is the most important thing on which we agree. The rest is techniques. The rest is technique. And I am not gonna be there to create those solutions. We need to rely on the professionals, and we have the bankers, we have the legal advice in the banks, and we have quite a number of people who have those solutions. And they had it at the beginning of the war. It's not a new type of prescription, but we will have the whole, I think, discussion at some moment here at this conference also on that. So we support the Commission's proposal. Again, it's important to do it in a proper way for the reasons both Jack has said, but also overall, not to have because, politicians say something that's no, but actually to have it properly done. But also I would like to refer to some things that both you and Matt alluded to, which is the peace in Ukraine that we all want, and the peace that should be both just, that should be lasting, that should make sure that Ukraine is as a strong, independent country with sufficient self-deterrence, self-defense capacity, with a deterrence, and so on and so forth. And I think it's very obvious, and I think President Trump clearly sees that there is only one person between him and that peace, and that is Butcher in the Kremlin. And I think that very clear message. There's also the discussion about the Nobel Peace Prize, and there's also that one person, I believe, between President Trump receiving Nobel Peace Prize. It's the same person. It's Putin. So very clearly, we support POTUS, we support President Trump in his quest for peace in Ukraine, and that peace has to be such that Ukraine is a strong, both militarily, politically, democratically country. And we'll do whatever it takes from us, from Latvia, both nationally, but also to make sure other allies, our friends in the US, partners around the world, global partners, actually understand that.
Okay, we've got 20 minutes for audience questions. I don't know if somebody has microphones. You've got mics over there. Just in terms of questioners, if you could say who you are briefly, not a life biography, and get straight to the question, that would be brilliant. So just show your hands if you're... Was there somebody over there? Yeah.
Hello, Dr. Hanna Shelest, Ukrainian Prism. You've been talking a lot about the efficiency of the drones' interceptions, procedures, and everything. But don't you think that Russians also try to check not only the procedures, but also the capabilities that you had? And the F-16 against the drones was the worst message that could be sent over there, because at least when you followed out the Russian sources, how they reacted to this, it was a demonstration that the big power really overusing their resources for the small hybrid tasks. So what would you do when the task would be of the same high level?
That's a very interesting question. Who wants to take it?
Yeah, let me be the one. Of course they say this. We always put a lot of emphasis on what the Russians say, and then we jump into it. The most important question for me is that we did respond with force and that we actually shot down a number of these drones. Again, I said we have to become much more effective when it comes to shooting down a large volume of cheap weapons with cheaper weapons. And that's where we have to go. And again, I think we can solve this problem if we really put our mind and our money to it. But we have to remember that a lot of the nations on the Eastern Front, and people always talk about the front, and that's the closest to the Russian or the Belarusian border. There is actually no front anymore. With cyber, with hypersonic missiles, everyone is living at the front now. But there's a lot of things changed in those nations along the eastern flank, because after they left the Soviet Union, a lot of these nations changed their laws in a way that the military actually had no power whatsoever in peacetime. for reasons that are understandable. And now, in a time where it's not peace, but it's not war at the same time, in the sort of gray zone, you need some wiggle room. And when the first drones came into Romania years ago already, they found out themselves that they had legal restrictions with regard to shooting it down. And then you can cry about NATO, but if you can't do it yourself, then it starts with that. And the same in Poland. Laws were changed in Poland to allow the defense of Rzeszów. It wasn't possible in the beginning. To give away part of your airspace to a military commander was not possible by law. They had to change the law. So all these things are happening due to what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. So the Russians can laugh what they want. We are readier than we were 3.5 years ago. The Russians will lose a war with NATO. I'm convinced they will not start a war with NATO. But we have to, as the ambassador said rightfully, and Secretary General Rutte said it as well, deterrence works, but we have to make sure it works in 3 to 5 years as well. And that's where we need to invest, as was agreed in The Hague. That's why we need more military. That's why we need those cheaper weapons against a larger volume. So we shut it down with what we have. That's true, and you can laugh about it. And the Dutch media, of course, said the same to me. So it's stupid to shoot with a 600,000 missile, a $20,000 drone. Yeah, that's fine, but we shut it down. Now, you cannot continue doing that over a longer war because it takes that missile takes about 8-9 months to make. So it's not only a money issue, it's also a production issue. So again, this should be a sign for us to become better in terms of fighting this cheaper threat. But we shouldn't pay too much attention to the Russians when it comes to what they say.
Jack.
There is an important caveat, which is that when you are in the Ukrainian air defense centers and you see these salvos come through, it is true that the Ukrainians are intercepting with relatively cheap effectors, interceptor drones, but these systems have a very, very short range. And the enemy decides which axis they take. So you almost never have enough of them ready on the axis that the drones come over. And the result is the Ukrainian military has to move its interceptors along the line. And so you might be whittling down the Shahids or the Garans over 150, 200, 300 kilometers, right, in Ukraine, and still some get through. Now, the issue for us is that we can't just replicate Ukrainian methods because the Baltic states don't have that much depth in their airspace before you get to the critical targets. Which means that while I think the question is actually quite correct that we do have capability gaps, we also need to think through our solutions so that we can take, let's say, a more Israeli approach and project depth in our ability to write these threats down, interdict launch, and demonstrate those kinds of capability, because just having relatively shallow depth with cheap interceptors will very quickly get overwhelmed. So it's not just about replicating Ukraine's solutions.
And we have to understand that we should learn the right lessons from this war. NATO is not going to fight this war the same way as, unfortunately, the Ukrainians have to. Because the Ukrainians do not have a number of capabilities that NATO has. So we will fight the Russians in a different way. And so we will fight the Russians in Russia in a different way than the Ukrainians now are doing. So that's not to say that the Ukrainians are not fighting the war in the right way for them, but we have different capabilities than the Ukrainians, and therefore we will fight this war in a different way. And if the Russians make that mistake, that we are Ukraine, then I'm not sure they will continue to say the same.
Just give some example of a different way.
F-35s.
Yeah, F-35s, deep precision strike.
B-2s.
Deep precision strike, The reason that the Russians are seriously nervous about the Tomahawks is a good example.
And cyber warfare?
Well, cyber warfare, of course. Tougher sanctions.
SEAL teams.
Special
I could go
forces.
on all day.
But not in Russia. I mean, we're talking about fight. Okay, at the back there. There's a mic coming to you.
Good afternoon. Toby Horton, Royal Australian Navy at the NATO Stratcom COE. We've spoken a lot about battling Russia and supporting Ukraine battling Russia, but this war is not against Russia alone. Russia is supported by a cast of enabling countries, organisations, corporations. The title of the panel this afternoon is What Next on the Path to Peace Through Strength. NATO takes pride in the strength of unity. What more are we doing or could we be doing to force or persuade those enablers to stop supporting Russia to get to peace quicker?
Great question. And I was going to, if I'd had time, pose the China question specifically.
To me.
Jack.
Okay. I'm actually going to circle back slightly and frame this in relation to China, because very often we talk about a US reprioritization as reducing our security, right? But the reality is, when you look at those missile salvos coming into Ukraine, you are, terrified by their scale, inspired by the skill of the Ukrainian air defenders and how they knock them down, and it's also horrifying how many get through. But I can tell you right now, it pales into insignificance when compared with the salvo weight that China would generate if it was in a war, all right? These two threats are orders of magnitude different in terms of industrial capacity, depth of magazines, etc. Now, the US has been very clear for a long time that their primary defense assumption is that they need to deter Chinese aggression in the Indo-Pacific from 2027 onwards, right? It is not in Europe's interest or NATO's interest for a war to break out in the Indo-Pacific. Just think about the economic impact on us alone. We could go into everything else. And so the US actually taking on the lion's share of that deterrence problem is in our interests. Of course, how things transition and how quickly they transition, and whether we are able to take up the slack, because this is a problem that will consume most US capacity, is a really important discussion. And it's a necessary discussion. And I think we have to keep that front and center when we're talking about these debates over how much we spend on NATO and the balance of commitment, which speaks to your point that we are dealing with a collaborating group of countries who are enabling this aggression. And the Chinese have been actually publicly quite clear that they are comfortable with this conflict continuing because it fixes their adversaries and it depletes our stockpiles. And it actually enriches them, right? So the challenge you then get into is that if the Chinese feel that what's going on is completely within their interests, then are you able to deter that through punishment or not? I mean, Australia has plenty of experience of how quickly you get into a aggressive and costly trade war when you start to push back on those things. And so, yes, I think we can do it, but in certain areas, but it will come at a very real cost, and a real cost which might impinge upon our economic ability to generate the defense capabilities we need. So the starting point for me is we need to understand that we are dealing with a large, complex problem, and that these issues are interrelated, and we shouldn't see activity in the Indo-Pacific as inherently trading off against the European theater, because they are very deeply connected.
Do you have any China sort of observations to make?
Well, the last piece I read was actually Jack's piece on how Russia will train and supply Chinese airborne battalion. And I think it was pretty enlightening if that is indeed something that is happening, with consequences that will be there. with the Chinese capabilities that they don't have currently. So for us, of course, in NATO, China is not a threat. It's not defined officially as a threat in the strategic concept. Okay, so the defense planning, and again, I refer to Rob, on the military side, the defense planning is absolutely different. Yeah. So, and for the EU, it's a challenge both in terms of security with regard how it enables the war in Ukraine. It is competitor because indeed, with its practices, with its subsidies, with its cross subsidies, and so on and so forth, it's very clearly competing unjustly on different rules with Europe. But it can also be, on selective cases, a collaborator. And in the UN, there have been a couple of cases where China was on the same side. So again, it's far more complex. It's far more complex also in political terms, in trade terms. We have countries in the EU who trade a lot. Our case is not such. We have pretty small trade with China, with which we also feel comfortable. So we don't have dependencies on any single country per se.
So I saw a thicket of hands last time. Yeah, the gentleman here in the third row. Huh? Oh, does he? Oh, sorry. He's speaking too loudly.
Thank you. Klaus Wittmann. I'm teaching contemporary history at Potsdam University. I'm a former Bundeswehr general. In Germany, we have a popular saying, if you want something, you find ways. If you don't want it, you find reasons. In my view, that is applicable to the frozen assets. I often held it publicly against our Chancellor Kohl in the Taurus cruise missile question. And there are other things. And in that context, I would like to come back to the discussion we had and the speculations about President Trump and Ukraine. I would hope that his growing disappointment with Putin's constant deception would lead him to use the same power and force in that case that he uses successfully, I hope, in the Middle East. And my concrete question to you, sir, is something that was already mentioned. What do you make of the observation that already the mention of the possibility of Tomahawk for Ukraine has led to frightened, almost panicked reactions in the Kremlin?
I assume he was looking at me. It's hard to tell. We can't
He
see
said
your
sir, so
eyes.
it's not
Well, I
Edward.
knew it wasn't you because it said sir, but I'll take this question. Don't worry about it.
He said ambassador.
Yeah, okay.
There's only one ambassador on the stage.
All right, I was trying to get out of it again. No, thank you.
There's 5 excellents.
I'm from Ankeny, Iowa, a place you've never heard of. So to be called Your Excellency is, for me, is kind of like funny. My mom and dad still can't believe it. But first of all, the United States, as the Admiral mentioned, I mean, we have capabilities that are currently not being deployed on the battlefield in Ukraine that are fearsome, that are powerful, and that can quite literally do serious damage at a place and time of our choosing. And that some of those are going to continue to be potentially moved to Ukraine for their use, and that could change the calculation. But obviously we haven't reached the point where Vladimir Putin has decided that the time is appropriate to negotiate. And I don't know. I mean, the problem that Vladimir Putin finds himself in is that he cannot demonstrate weakness, even though he is incredibly weak. There's been several things. I mentioned two. I mentioned the Tomahawks. They did react strongly. The French taking the Shadow Fleet ship, they did react strongly. And the third thing they reacted strongly to was President Trump calling him a paper tiger, where they spent a day trying to convince us they're a bear. Right? And isn't that funny? And I think Ruta said it best. Bears don't have to convince you they're bears. They just are. And I think that's a really good point. And I think it is. I've said it before, but I'll share this with you as well. I literally, if you had a snail start from the border of Russia and Ukraine and continue for the last 3.5 years, it would now be in Poland. And they are not even 20% into the country. So I think that demonstrates just sort of how inept, how ineffective, inept, incompetent the Russian military has proven on the battlefield. And I just think, we need to prepare because they're reckless. They are certainly, as someone wants to describe them as a gas station with nuclear weapons. But whatever they are, we need to be prepared, but we need to make sure we're strong. And so they will never challenge us, not only based on what we've seen from them, but also just how we would fight this war so differently. The U.S. generals, and sometimes they're overconfident, and that has led us throughout our history into some unfortunate situations. But in this case, I think together with what the equalization that's happening on the European continent and our allies actually stepping up with capabilities, and I've seen it in Lithuania with the German tank battalion. I've seen it here in Latvia with the multi-country battle group, and I've seen it in Estonia as well, and the investment in things like HIMARS and artillery and the exercises that we do together. We are exactly where we need to be, and we're only getting stronger. We can do a lot more on counter UAV. We are doing a lot more on counter UAV. It's a blessing and a curse that's been said to live in consequential times, and this is a real moment.
Very briefly, I think it's important for us to recognize that 5 Tomahawks is not going to make any difference whatsoever, right? The reason why the Russians are scared and react to the possibility of Tomahawk showing up is because it would suggest a significant change in US policy, whereby a lot of other material goes in as well, including potentially technologies that facilitate and enable what Ukraine is building. And Ukraine is building a stockpile of long-range strike systems. You've seen the stuff around Flamingo, but there are others that can really start servicing enough targets in Russia to do strategic level damage, right? Or operationally significant levels of damage to the Russian capacity to wage war. And so it's not one or two Tomahawks, which is a political and symbolic act. It's what follows behind them and what they represent. And it's exactly the same reason why the Russians freaked out when a Shadow Fleet vessel was interdicted. Not because the loss of one Shadow Fleet vessel is significant, but because if Europe shows that it is prepared to start seizing them systematically, you do something pretty dramatic to the Russian economy, right? And so they are revealing their pressure points. But it's important for us not to obsess on the symbol rather than on the content behind it. And the reality is Europe more widely has a lot of things it could do that could help contribute to the effect that the Russians are scared of when they're signaling their discomfort with Tomahawk.
Minister, I'll give you the final word because we have run out of time.
I think we have covered largely the 3 main pillars that we need to be doing on the way to peace through strength, and that is making ourselves stronger. So that's national, but also making NATO stronger and having transatlantic relationship that is crisis-free. So making sure that we settle the issues if they arise and continue invest in defense. Making sure that Russia is weakened, because our problem is Russia, our problem is not Ukraine. So degrading Russian military capability, economy, income from oil, gas, not letting sanctions go, and so on and so forth. And third, most important, sustaining Ukraine's self-defense. And for that, we all need to keep doing what we have been doing and increase it. It's Ukrainians fighting, they're fighting for all of us. It's Article 51 of the UN Charters that they are fighting for. So we're all in it together.
Well, on that note, please join me in thanking a wonderful panel which covered a lot of